Hello EPQ students. If you've reached this point in the EPQ, firstly, congratulations because you really are near the end. That said, the summary and reflection is an absolutely vital part of the EPQ. As a coordinator, I look at it a lot. It's a great opportunity to score marks. Don't forget that many of the marks in the EPQ aren't always visible in the actual report or the artifact themselves. They come from the background story and from your reflections. So this is a real opportunity to score marks. Now, some of the slides today, I'm going to go through quite quickly because this is a very long screencast otherwise. And I think it's best that I will put them on the screen and you could pause and freeze and read them later. Otherwise, this will be too long. So what am I going to be looking to cover today? I'm looking at an overview of the task of the summary and reflection. I'm going to be looking at making the most of the assessment criteria. I'm going to touch on how to write the summary, not the most important element of the summary and reflection, but still a task worth looking at in a bit of detail. I'm going to look at the idea of skills building and evidence, knowledge building. I'm going to look also at project-based learning and this idea of independence, which I think you need to stress. A-levels have become more and more spoon-fed, so the EPQ is vital in terms of allowing you as students to have agency and to discuss what it was like being able to control your own work and decide how you were going to do it. I'm going to look at the idea of reflecting on your learning, assessment objective 4, the benefits of hindsight, and how to advise others. Now, these are the questions that you are given in the final summary and reflection. What I have learned from completing this project, what new knowledge or expertise have I found, what are the strengths and weaknesses of my project, what skills have I improved, what changes should I make if I undertook such work again. That's very important. It's the essence of project-based learning, as I'll show you in a moment. What advice would I give to others undertaking such a project? Okay, so there's quite a lot to cover, and those are just guidance questions. However, I would use them and tick them off as you go because I think they are important. Now, in terms of the assessment objectives, this is, as I say, a very important time to hit every one of the assessment objectives. So you want to say something about the management of the project. You want to say something about the use of resources. You want to say something about the develop and realize, showing your problem-solving skills, your decision-making, and your critical thinking, and you're looking for evidence of that as much as possible. Let's not forget that 40% of the grade comes from develop and realize, and the presentation together with the summary and reflection is one of the main places where that will happen. In AO4, the review, that's where you look at your learning and you reflect back and you think about improvements and you think about what you're proud of, okay? And those questions certainly do cover that. Assessment objective 4, I want to stress in a lot more detail. Here it asks in the top band for detailed and careful evaluation of the strengths and weaknesses, okay? And to show your own learning during the project. So the personal pronouns, the use of the word I, with clear evidence of tracking your thought process and showing evidence of learning and getting better and making mistakes but learning from them. And that's why altogether this will give you sound evidence of your judgment, okay? Don't forget, interestingly, in AO4, it's also communication skills. So your writing and your speaking in the presentation should also be covered in this particular part of the production log. Assessment objective number 3, that's problem solving, decision making, creative thinking, and achieving planned outcomes. I'm going to pick out a few key phrases here. You have to show that you have thoroughly analyzed your data. So if your data is a literature review, that you've gone into a great deal of critical evaluation of your sources, you've thought about your sources, you've made judgments between them. You haven't simply used the resources, you've also evaluated them. So you want to show your decision making, why you made particular decisions, okay, and that there are clear and appropriate reason for changes. So this should occur throughout the production log, but you reflect upon it in your final summary and reflection. And synthesizing is a key idea. And I think that that's absolutely key in the summary and reflection, because that is a synthesis. It's bringing things together and showing the learning and having an effective overall picture of it. Now, in terms of the summary, I'm not going to say too much here, other than the summary should be quite brief. Now, I would suggest that perhaps you think about pausing the slide in a moment. You're looking for a kind of summary of the project of no more than 130 words. This is a very good example of somebody summarizing over here and looking at the idea of a brief recap, reference to a larger issue, highlighting the important aspects of the project, a very brief evaluation of the arguments, and I think the absolute key idea would be the take-home message. So that's how you might want to begin your summary and reflection, with a little summary statement like that. And here is an excellent example of what a summary should look like. It addresses the question, should the government take measures to discourage the amount of binge drinking which occurs in Britain today? You'll see it's 120 words. And I suggest that you pause the screencast now and have a look at this summary, because it is an absolutely superb example of one. Now, I'm going to move on to the question of reflection and action. I spoke earlier about the need to address assessment criteria number 4, which is the reflection element. And this is, in addition to the presentation, an absolute key moment for you to earn some good marks for this particular aspect of the mark scheme. So I've called this slide the benefit of hindsight. This is one of the things that you're doing in the reflection. You're looking back, and with the benefit of hindsight, you're deciding where you could have been better. Now, self-criticism of this kind is a sign of intellectual maturity. So I would strongly recommend that you do this. We are all better when we do things repetitively and we have the ability to go back, okay? So have a quick read of this. I particularly like this bit where the student says, I would also stress the need to put aside modern day biases when studying ancient history. For example, I, as a modern Western reader, first encountered Augustus. This is a EPQ about Augustus. My initial reaction was to turn back on him because he had reduced freedom. And then he goes on to reflect and to talk about his own modern bias. So this is a good one for a kind of history humanities student, but it doesn't matter what your EPQ is. Use this idea of the benefit of hindsight to see how you could be better next time. Now, problem and solution formula, I've called this one, okay? One of my project strengths was that I had a clear plan that divided the whistleblowing into 3 main stages of design. And he goes on to explain why this was so effective, okay? So if you are thinking about scoring some really good marks under AO3, you show how you encountered a problem, and then you go into how you solve that particular problem and why you're proud or pleased with your work. And at all times, you are looking to emphasize skills acquisition, knowledge acquisition, okay? Here's a very good example of skills acquisition in terms of report writing. I now know how to write a report in the correct sequence and to use appropriate academic language. This includes creating an abstract, having a short but impactful introduction, writing a concise literature review, synthesizing a conclusion, putting together a comprehensive bibliography and appendices. In addition, he talks about using critical evaluation here, using the CRAP formula, which you can watch in some of my other videos if you need to. So that's a very good example of this particular student highlighting how much he's learned, and in particular, how much he's learned about academic writing and the genre of the EPQ report. Now, the EPQ is a kind of project-based learning. So in your final reflection, it would be a good idea to talk about how you coped with this. As I said earlier, A-levels do have a reputation of being very teacher-directed. The EPQ, on the other hand, as you know, is student-driven. and you have chosen your own EPQ title. So it might be a very good time for you to reflect on how you've coped with this different style of learning. Some of the key elements of project-based learning you will recognize in the EPQ. The idea of student voice and choice, the idea of inquiry, the idea of it being authentic, in other words, being applied to the world, okay? Reflection, which is what we're doing now, highlighting your reflection. A publicly presented product. Now you know that that's what the EPQ presentation is all about. The process of feedback and revision, which you get with your supervisor or with your technical mentors, whoever it is that you've been working with. So I think it's a very good time for you to think about how you've coped with this form of learning. Have you enjoyed it? Has it contrasted a great deal with the mainstream curriculum if you're doing A-level? Or if you're doing a kind of BTEC, was it quite similar to BTEC perhaps? An interesting moment for you to reflect here is the fact that Southampton University's research shows very clearly that EPQ students do better in all of their degrees. Now that's very interesting. And I think it might be time for you to talk about the fact that this kind of independent research-based learning might be very good for university. Many students do say that, and they write to me later and they talk about how the EPQ was perhaps the most important and valuable thing that they did during their time at college. Now, another person who is very interesting is John Dewey, and he is the kind of originator of project-based learning, we might say. And his famous phrase is learning by doing. Now, this is very much the philosophy of the EPQ. It may have been at times that when you started, you felt plunged into some kind of whirlpool where you didn't know what you were doing. Now, John Dewey believes that students do need to go through difficulty in order to truly learn things. And he argues that deeper learning happens when the student is genuinely engaged in directing the learning. Now, he might be a person you might want to refer to in this particular case, or you can refer to the whole idea of reducing the scaffolding. What do I mean by this? Well, this is another term that's very popular in teaching. It comes from a Russian psychologist called Vygotsky. And the idea is that very often students need to actually have some kind of scaffolding to help them in lessons. However, if we give students too much scaffolding, then the idea is that you're not really learning anything and you're not trying out things for yourself. So the EPQ is all about reducing the scaffolding and making the students survive on their own. Now, there can be periods of, as I say, great confusion, but there can also be periods of incredible creative and critical learning. So that might be something for you to refer to. Another very interesting idea is Art Costa, who is an education theorist who wrote a very good book called The Habits of Mind. And it goes beyond education to look at highly successful people. And from his study, he works out that there are, according to him, 16 different habits of mind which ensure success. And I'm just going to pause on a couple of them. Thinking independently, how important that is, yeah? Thinking flexibly, okay? Persisting. Thinking with clarity and precision. Creating, imagining, and innovating. Now, these are skills that I think the EPQ really does foster. So once again, in the reflection, if that has been your experience, it might be time for you to reflect upon the EPQ journey and to consider what it is that you've learned, not only in terms of educational knowledge things, but what kind of characteristics of learning, your kind of learning disposition. And I think these habits of mind are very interesting. I think it's very important as well because we've seen, I've moved from IB to A-level. There is very little presentation in A-level teaching. And of course, a major part of the EPQ is the public presentation. And for many students, that can be quite nerve-wracking, but it can also be very empowering. It can be a moment of pride when you actually share your learning. And it's quite unique in terms of a British school experience, I think, to be able to present your work in this particular way. So that's something I would strongly advise that you put into the reflection and you think about it, both in terms of character building, but also in terms of maybe cultivating public speaking and that sort of thing. Now, this slide I thought was very interesting, and I'm not going to read it all out because that would be really dull. You might want to pause it and have a little look at it. Why I liked it is after my presentation, I must admit I felt a little bit upset. Now, I like this because of the actual honesty of it and about the learning experience and reflecting that learning can be quite hard, it can be quite difficult, it can be quite stressful, it can be quite emotional for us. So I think that that's an excellent and really interesting reflection that I encountered. Now, moving on. Here's another one where I found really interesting, where the student actually reflected about realizing that the ethics of research is so important, okay? Here she says, due to the sensitivity of the research, I initially felt like I was potentially exploiting the participants, okay, because she was studying a serious mental illness. And I thought that this was excellent because she really did realize that research can be extremely risky and that people need to consider the morals and the ethics of the research. Now, with the remainder of the slides, I'm going to suggest you pause them and read them yourself, because once again, I think it'll be very tedious if I read them out. I think moving out of one's comfort zone is a very interesting thing to address, and this student does that very well. Moving on to the next slide. Decision-making and reflection. Here, the student very clearly explains why they have made the decisions that they have, and I would strongly urge you to do something quite similar. Demonstrating the learning. However, I realized that the question was too broad to the research and there was a lack of research to support the sides. The journey taught me about resilience as I kept going and pushing myself through. So here we see a student who's learning how to devise a research question and learning that incredibly valuable experience of moving from something that is perhaps under-researched or too general to having a very specific research question which is answerable and that has a clear research base. And that is an excellent example of demonstrating learning in the reflection piece. Reflecting again on the presentation, very, very important, as I said earlier here. This student also talks about using more highly technical vocabulary and having to learn in the presentation how to translate that into more layman language. We know that one of the key things of the presentation is not to be too technical, whereas the written report is written for an expert audience. The presentation is to be delivered to a public audience that needs to be able to understand you. So that process of writing your speeches into accessible English is a great learning opportunity. Here's an excellent one on skills acquisition here, okay, and how this particular student learned about their strengths and weaknesses, improving researching, essay skills, and referencing. Problem solving is a key one. You'll remember at the beginning of my presentation, I talked about AO3, problem solving, decision making, showing that you've come to decisions through a process of thought and a methodical process in which you've eliminated all the different variables and decided on your course of action. Reflection is absolutely key, as I've said, AO4. So think about your learning here. As soon as I started trusting the process and believing in my own ideas, the sooner I was able to craft my argument. So once again, I'd suggest that you pause this and read that. It's an absolutely excellent paragraph to include in a reflection. And although I apologize for this being a little bit blurry, this is an excellent paragraph on lessons learned and in particular how this CRAP test was used for critical evaluation and how that will go on to help this particular student as he goes on to study economics at university. And now in conclusion, the summary and reflection, as I've shown, is a key aspect of scoring marks. I would strongly advocate that you write 1,000 to 1,500 words in this. and really evaluate both the project as a whole and your own learning. Avoid generic comments and really get specific and be true to yourself, because that truth comes across and it's something that the marker will look for. Try to show aspects of metacognition. Metacognition is learning about learning. What have you learned about your own learning? Have you been able to talk a little bit about project-based learning, as I've said there? Were you able to cope with the independence and the increased cognitive load that comes with not being taught or directed all of the time, okay? Illustrate your observations with specific details so that you personalize your learning journey. Reflect upon the validity and strengths of your conclusion. That's, of course, in the report. So you could say, are you happy with your conclusion? Do you feel that you came to a highly evidence-based conclusion? Did your project succeed, in other words? And of course, you can still be critical of yourself and get an A star. Nobody's expecting you to be a PhD at this particular level. Yeah. Reflect on whether your artifact achieved its intended purpose, if you were an artifact person. Learning is affective. It's about emotions. What did you learn about yourself? What coping mechanisms did you develop? What kind of learning dispositions, as I said, have you developed as a result of the EPQ? And how do you imagine this might help you in your future career and your future studies at university? And finally, look to the future, as I say. Is this a topic that fascinates you? Will you continue to study it later? Or is it just a topic that has helped enhance your learning skills, your referencing skills, and your researching skills? So to conclude, finally, this is a key time for an EPQ candidate to score as many marks as you can. So be thoughtful, be specific, and be interesting and engaging. I hope that this was a useful video podcast, and best of luck finishing your EPQ. I hope that you get that elusive A star. Thank you.